Well, thank you so much, Chet, for joining me today. Really excited to talk about an industry that is in all of our lives, right? Every single day, everybody uses the internet. Obviously, there's people around the world that still don't quite have access. And even in the developed world, there's still many people in many communities that don't have access to, really good high-speed internet. And so before we get into what Starry is and its sort of mission and vision, talk a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I mean, I've been around communications industry pretty much most of my career. My first company was supplied software to the cable industry and ultimately was acquired by Microsoft. But so I've been in the industry for, gosh, starting 2000, so 22 years at this point. And it's a fascinating industry because it's essential, right? At
Yep.
one level, it's non-discretionary, and as a business, it could be a very attractive business. Obviously, it's difficult to do these things just because the amount of money you need to raise and the amount of technology you need to develop, and
Sure.
it's physical work, right? It's not basically, it's not like a software company that's just making an app or something like that. Kind of you go into it and say, okay, this is interesting. As an industry, it is very powerful because you have this connection with the consumers 24/7, and there are pockets of opportunity. And in particular, for Starry, we sort of looked at it and said, okay, if we can innovate and create really interesting technology that can solve for some basic issues, which is lowering the cost of building a network, number one, then we've got a shot at it. And in particular, our focus is urban areas just because of the technology we're using. And in the United States, the government has a lot of focus and funding, if you will, for the rural parts of the country. But for urban, not really till about now, where the government is talking about affordability in these things. So we, when we were starting the company, collectively thought there would be an opportunity as the cable guys continue to raise prices, service is terrible, as you mentioned, there will be a pocket of opportunity to serve urban customers with the technology that we've built. And obviously, as you think about urban, you think about various areas in urban and in the urban infrastructure, including affordable housing or other types of housing that is targeted towards people with lower income, less opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. So the holistic way, as we sort of thought about it, it made sense to go into the sector, start a company, and put the mission front and center. And the mission being obviously providing affordable connectivity to all. That journey started and we built the technology. It took us about 4 years, a couple $100 million investment in R&D.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what these kinds of companies are hard to do because it's a lot of money and a lot of risk and all those kinds of things come into play.
Well, it's probably why there haven't been much innovation, because it's so hard to get into it that people founders will just choose to kind of go somewhere else and build something faster, quicker, much cheaper for them to don't have to raise as much capital. It takes some vision, and it takes
it also comes down to kind of what are you really solving for as a person and as a team. You're solving for making quick return, or you're solving for a meaningful impact and hopefully a great return as part of that, right? So if you put both into the calculus, then you say, okay, which tends not to be an innovation cycle, right? Most innovation type companies are focused on whatever the latest trend is and how to drive a quick return.
Wait, I want to kind of talk about the technology a little bit here. I guess, how is it fundamentally different than traditional sort of, fiber that you have to break the street up, right? To build these fiber optic cables to get, high-speed internet to houses, specifically in urban areas. And obviously it's the same in rural. There's just, longer, fiber pipes, I guess you can call it. But I guess, how is Starry fundamentally different from a technology standpoint? Like, what is those 4 years? What have you been building?
Yeah, so what ends up happening is the most expensive part of the network is the last mile. And so what we do is we say, okay, so let's just focus on that for a second. The middle mile, you can get lots of fiber from existing third-party providers, both in very competitive rates, just because a lot of that fiber got built for serving the mobile industry.
Okay.
And so you've got the middle mile fiber, and that's available to you. And then you say, so let's solve the last mile problem. And what we did was we said, okay, a couple of governing principles. If we're going to solve the last mile, then the most logical thing to think about is doing it wirelessly. If you're going to do it wirelessly, it comes with different constraints. What kind of a spectrum are you going to use? Because Wireless obviously depends on, licensed spectrum from the FCC, the federal government. So what are you going to use? And that spectrum also comes in different kinds of flavors. It comes in, what is called mid-band or low band, meaning that's what the cellular companies use, for example. It propagates really, really well. But the problem is it's incredibly expensive. So, if you look at these companies have spent billions upon billions of dollars. For example, in the last auction, I think Verizon spent like $52 billion in acquiring spectrum. So again, as you're
Yeah.
innovating, you're coming into the market with a couple of pennies in your pocket, if you will. You don't have billions of dollars to go buy spectrum. So you look elsewhere. So we decided to focus on what is called high frequency or millimeter wave spectrum, meaning it's several orders of magnitude higher in frequency than what you use for television or mobile phones and things like that. And this spectrum has been largely sitting fallow in the country and in the world. And the good news about that spectrum is there's a lot of it, and you can have large, what we call channel sizes in the business, mainly because the bigger the pipe, the more stuff you can jam through it, right? The negative is it doesn't go very far, and it gets impeded with buildings and walls and trees and all kinds of things. So you really have to sort of design the technology with those kinds of considerations in mind. So basically, Starry took those kind of technological approaches, built the radio technology for the last mile using what has historically been fallow, undervalued spectrum to start building a coverage fabric, if you will, in urban areas. And we started in Boston first in 2019, and then have slowly been expanding throughout 5 or 6 different cities. That allows us to have coverage in cities. That allows us to then go into, and knock on people's doors and say, hey, this is a new alternative. Are you interested? Obviously, and as you point out, there's a lot of customer dissatisfaction. So you end up, winning a lot of customer share as part of that. So the real innovation in this has been, typically if you're rolling out fiber, you're counting on billions and billions of dollars going into a city,
Yep.
digging up trenches and this and that. And so the biggest and big innovation that we've done is that we can build a network at 1% of the cost of what it would cost you to do a fiber network. Once you lower the cost that dramatically, what that allows you to do is to turn profit and have a return at a much lower customer take rate, right? So typically, if you're building a fiber system, you need 40 to 50% of the customers in the area to take your service for you to make a return, which it's really hard to do against, if there's a big cable provider in the market, et cetera, et cetera. So for us, with this innovation, we can turn a profit at, 4 or 5% of the customers taking, or turn break even at 4 to 5% of the customers taking the service, which allows you to then have a investable profile that you can pitch to investors. So it's a long sort of process and these kinds of companies, they don't happen overnight, right? You're working with the FCC for years trying to figure out when the auctions are going to be and when spectrum is going to come in. So it's a great business in that sense that most logical human beings avoid this kind of crap, right?
Yeah.
So competition is less of a problem, and if you figured it out, then it's an incredibly exciting set of opportunities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You mentioned cities. What goes into a new city? Is it just looking at, market research in a specific area, or do you have to go to governments first, right? Like what's the type of interaction with a city or a state when you go into a new city?
No interaction necessary, really,
Okay.
because what
Okay.
you're really doing is if you were using what are called private right-of-ways, public right-of-ways, which things like municipal furniture, think utility poles, think traffic lights and whatnot, then you need to work with the city. But if you're not, and you're using private infrastructure, which is what we do so things like cellular towers or rooftops of private buildings, things along those lines, you don't really need permission with the
Mm,
exception of local zoning. But yeah, so it's actually a fairly seamless process. It just takes money. So you go in
right.
and you cut deals with companies like American Tower, Crown Castle, and people that provide vertical infrastructure. You pay them a monthly rent, and that
Gotcha.
monthly rent allows you to basically bolt your radios on their towers and rooftops and whatnot, and go from there.
We talked about, affordable internet, urban areas. Digital divide to me is a big issue for me because I think just access to the internet can change a person's life. Literally, I mean, it changed my life. So, it just has that power. As COVID sort of obviously really, really just destroyed sort of the way we move, right, in the world, the way we go to school, the way we parent, the way we do our jobs, all these different things. What was those couple of years like when that sort of being, being a provider of internet, right, and that infrastructure, which was so needed then? I guess what was those years like for you and the company? Did you see a lot of growth there, and was there opportunity to really sell your mission and vision during that time?
It was a really interesting sequence of events for us. On one hand, there was a lot of, we nearly doubled the size of the company, by the way, through that period in 2020 itself, and then
Yeah.
again in 2021. But it was a real interesting set of circumstances where, on one hand, you had this sort of, need for more internet, more affordable, more connectivity. The FCC was putting out calls for companies to not disconnect people, providing subsidy.
Yeah.
We all sort of signed pledges to not disconnect customers if they couldn't pay, et cetera, et cetera. So we did all these kinds of programs. The flip side, though, was, and a lot of companies, saw a boom in the pandemic because, people just worked from home, and then they were buying more things and they had more disposable income and all kinds of different things. And the government assistance was helping. In our case, all of those factors were true for sure. But the bigger challenge was, we are a physical infrastructure company, right? So we had to make sure that our people were safe, but yet going out and in the world and, performing their duties. That included going into people's homes for installing service. That was going into buildings for maintenance. That was going in, in towers and all kinds of different things for maintenance and upgrades and whatnot. But the most fascinating thing was through this period, and that just kind of tells you how pissed off the consumers are. I mean, people are concerned, global pandemic, people are washing their vegetables and apples and whatnot. Nobody's, touching surfaces, but yet people had us come into their homes to, disconnect cable and activate Starry. So that was kind of a fascinating sort of
Yeah.
thing, but that allowed us to sort of, it really kind of forced the company to come together, galvanize us into action, and honestly, we actually had sort of this period where the capital markets were shut down. We were running low on capital and money,
Hmm.
and the team just sort of came together and pulled it off, which was just huge for investors to see, because that just kind of showed the investors the resiliency of the company and the product and the demand in a arguably one of the most difficult times that we've seen in our in the recent past. That also created an opportunity for us where Virginia Lam, who heads up our government affairs and strategic advancement, and she really dove into this and said, look, this is going to create both a very meaningful opportunity for us to accelerate the Starry Connect part of the business, which is where we go into affordable housing and public housing, because on one side, the demand is there and these folks are being, not served appropriately by existing providers. On the other side, the government's going to be supportive of these kinds of activities as well.
Hmm.
So we
Yep.
latched on to that as a meaningful opportunity. And we started from, in 2019 through end of 2021, we ended up at about 57,000 apartments in affordable housing
Wow.
where we provide activated the service. And I think, as you said, the pandemic exacerbated, and I look at that as less exacerbation, more it pulled forward a
Yeah.
lot of what the future was
Right.
going to be. So the reliance on digital technologies for education, for healthcare, all those kinds of things became a acceleration.
Are there current subsidies for access to high-speed internet like there is for, food or to buy electric cars? There's subsidies to grow certain foods, right? There's all kind of subsidies. And some subsidies are not even, good for the environment or good for our health or good for a lot of things, right? And this seems like this is good for humanity. So this would be something I would feel like would almost be of course, not easy, right? But there's a good argument to make to subsidize us in some way.
Yeah, there are. So the FCC initially during the pandemic came up with, they've had these programs like Lifeline and things along those lines historically for affordable parts of the community. But the FCC came out with, during the pandemic, what they call the emergency broadband benefit, which
Hmm.
was $50 a month per family for, towards internet. And then as part of the Biden infrastructure bill, they put in a lot of money and made it into a permanent program, and that is $30 a month that a family can have for, and it's called ACP, which is the Affordable Connectivity Program. So that allows us to go into, for example, public housing and say, hey, if you live here, it doesn't matter what your credit is, which is an important point to note, right? Because a lot of folks, even though if they have the ability to pay, may have
Right.
bad credit. But this emergency program kicked off the way where we were able to qualify every public housing that we're going into as designated for affordable connectivity program and emergency broadband benefit programs. So that allows us to serve these folks without imposing credit checks or, hey, were you in default before or this or that or whatever, any of those conditions. And so I think that things are headed in the right direction. I think there is generally a lot of recognition in Washington, it seems, that broadband is critical and essential. Typically, people, obviously tend to focus on their voter base, right? And so it used to be more along the rural part of the country doesn't have broadband, which is true. A good portion of the rural part is really deficient. So there was a lot of activity to support that. But now with the infrastructure bill, there's an equal recognition, it seems, or at least some recognition that affordability is also a component of access, right? It's not just that, hey, you have it in the city, but at what cost and what conditions. So affordability has become another, important component of these government programs as well. So that's helpful.
When you first, started to get this, idea, and obviously it is it's a big idea, right? It's like you said, it's very a capital intensive sector. And to even get into this, you have to have a serious vision. You have to have a serious will to tackle this issue. When you were, thinking about doing Starry, did you come at it from a point of view where the sector is so sort of monopolized, right? And there hasn't been a lot of innovation. This is ripe for sort of disruption. Or was it looking at the digital divide is humongous and giving millions of people access to the internet is really good for us as a society. It's also good for us as a company and our investors. What angle did you come, or was it a little bit of both? Or I guess what angle, interests you and the team the most?
I think the team, obviously, like diverse teams, they tend to have different people that have different passions and interests and things along those lines. As a leader, you're trying to integrate all of those things into a common theme and a common thrust. We really looked at it saying, okay, the sector has an opportunity for disruption, and one vector that we could accelerate would be the affordable part, Starry Connect, because that would give us a firm footing going into it to scale the business, right? So you kind of look at those. I tend to look at the business, or really, I think hopefully most entrepreneurs do, in terms of how do I manage risk at a certain stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're taking risk across the board, and which segment of the market risk that I'm willing to take that I have higher conviction in. And our view was, look, the affordable part is going to be a worthwhile risk because A, ESG style initiatives. B, all of those investors also understand that it's because the only time you lose a customer in this business is when people leave their apartment, right? And they move out or sell their house or whatever that case happens to be. In affordable, these folks are more permanent, if you will, right? They're multi-generational households. So you're banking also on the fact that you're going to have a very long life customer which is going to improve your return as well, right? So it's a mix of all of those priorities that drive it. And some of it was also based on the technological approach we were taking. And in cities, historically, the challenge for if you're doing a wireline construction, for example, right, meaning you're laying fiber or whatever else, like I mentioned, you're counting on 40-50% people taking your service. So as a result, what ends up happening, and you're counting on them paying you $100 a month, whatever the number
Right.
happens to be.
Yeah.
When you're doing it wirelessly, you are covering irrespective of, so think of it as kind of a redlining question, right? If you are if you don't think as a fiber builder that people are going to pay you $100 or 50% of this area is going to pay you $100 a month, you're not going to build it because you don't think you're going to get any return, which is what ends up happening, right? So you've got wealthier parts of the city that may have a upgraded network because the operator thinks that they're going to have a return, and the less wealthier parts of the city will have nothing because they can't justify it, or they will have the old phone lines, or one cable company that's gouging people or whatever it is. And when you're doing it the way we're doing it with wireless technology, the signal doesn't really stop, right? And if it's going to radiate a mile, it's going to radiate a mile, and it doesn't care whether the radiation is not radiation, but the signal is going over homes that are what kind of income they have, right? So that allows you to have kind of your cake and eat it too, where you're saying, okay, I'm going to put my radios up in these areas. There's a mix there. There's some wealthier parts, which is great, and then there's certain affordable parts, which is great because I can then go to these folks and offer them a highly, effective service at a lower price. So it creates a opportunity set which, traditionally wouldn't be available, irrespective of a company's intent, in that sense.
When you talk about the overall sort of, mission of Starry, the big issue of connectivity, right? And like you said, we're sort of moving into a world where, COVID just moved us up probably a decade or two, right? Into what was coming regardless. What type of, I guess, mission and vision is scalable, right? Like I think I talk to a lot of, companies where their impact is, it's hard to scale their impact, right? Because they're, and while you do have sort of a human capital side of it, right? Kind of boots on the ground, so to speak, it's really hard to scale impact, right? It's really hard to like get people your product, or, help people at scale, or, affect the environment at scale in a positive way a couple more decades out, right? The impact here is pretty scalable, right? And when we do have, connectivity in a wider range of homes, what does that look like for, I guess when you were looking at this, did you look at research around like, hey, when a household has access to high speed, like affordable internet, like these outcomes can happen, right? There is a sort of an economic ladder or educational ladder that is reached, obviously, if you didn't have the internet, right? Or something that is dependable. Have you guys looked at that? Just statistics in general around what this can do to a household and community when.
We did, and you're absolutely right, because you know COVID has sort of pulled, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a social scientist, maybe a decade
Sure.
or whatever it
Yeah.
is, and there's plenty of data, economic activity data that was available. Even, not, we weren't consciously chasing that information, but anecdotally, that was certainly available. That, look, the economic opportunity is a function of some of these utilities being available to consumers, right? And I mean, you could just see throughout history that's played out, when you had electricity, different things happened, and transportation,
Right,
different
right.
things happened, et cetera, et cetera. And I tend to take a more sort of incidental or gut check sort of view of the world as well, where I'll give you an example. All of Starry's customer support functions are in-house, but they are all remote. They were native remote as when we started the company. It was all the tools were built in for enable, cloud-based sort of support infrastructure, if you will. And that was an obvious extension. You could say, okay, if you're able to provide connectivity, you just created the opportunity to work from home for a segment of that population that may not have access to
Yes.
transportation, for example, right?
Yeah.
And boy, did you create that opportunity for $50 a month without even a credit check, versus if they were to have to go buy a car, right? That'd be thousands of dollars, and they need credit, they need this, they need that. So, that's one dimension. But these were all sort of anecdotal, sort of instinctive, if you will, decisions we made, because it's kind of obvious. I think, I forget which airline first started, and they were hiring, I think, stay-at-home moms, for example, to be their customer care representatives. And
Right.
again, that's an
Right.
interesting strategy, because you've got a isolated population base that you can employ, right? And you can scale that network of employees because there is a population behavior pattern that is available to you. You look at that in education, same thing. And I think when we started, and this kind of a business, right, connectivity is step one. Ultimately, it's services that matter. So connectivity is step one, devices step two. So, for example, we have a partnership with Microsoft that contributes a substantial amount of dollars towards subsidizing devices for consumers that are in there, right? So, I mean, great, I have broadband. Now, what do I do with it, right? I need a laptop or this, that, whatever it happens to be.
Right. Right.
And then I think the next layer is going to be services, whether it's educational content, or if let's say you've got elderly, right, that are looking for healthcare virtually.
Mm,
What kind of
yeah.
appliances or devices that you could put in there, right? So we've done projects, for example, with some of our real estate partners, where we put in voice activated things in every elderly apartment because that's a great assistance feature for those folks. If you're going to be working, let's say you're a creator, a content creator, right? And you're a 22-year-old kid making YouTube content. It's a
Yep.
great way to, supplement your income or whatever that happens to be. You got a good, robust connection. You can upload lots, 4K video and, get more subscribers. And so it's so many dimensions.
Yep.
And as a creator and engineer, one of your biggest thrills and the biggest fear that you have is you're working on something. And I think this goes to your scaling point a little bit. You're making something which nobody's going to use, or it's going to have marginal utility for people. What we call in the business, we all loosely refer to as product market fit, right? In this sector, right, that fear is not there because ultimately what you're making, people will use. People use their connection 14, 15 hours a day, right? The challenge is
Yeah.
the opposite, how to make sure they're going to be satisfied for 14, 15 hours a day. So all of those factors sort of go into sort of planning and thinking ultimately, and to make and it's not just about financial success at the end of the day, right? I mean, it's a well-known fact that none of us are getting out of here alive. So the question is, who are you choosing to work with? How are you creating value in their lives and your life and your people that you interact with? So a mission like this unifies a lot of different kinds of diverse people and with different spirits to come together because at the end of the day we're all looking for purpose in some way, shape, or form, right?
We talked about internet, right? A lot, but I guess from a layman's, right? Like not everybody knows the ins and outs of all this. What type of internet is it, right? Comparable to traditional broadband net? Like, is it on par? Is it like the exact same? Does it have the potential like to be better? Like, I guess in
Um,
comparison to normal stuff that we know.
Today, it's at par or better. And I'll go into a couple of features. Typically on your cable connection, when you upload, you have a much smaller, skinnier pipe going up versus download. So we have the ability, so we do much larger upload speeds, if you will, hundreds of megabits a second. So that's a great advantage for consumers. Latency is another thing, meaning how much jitter you're going to have. You click a button and how fast the response. Now, if you're using a web page, that latency is not that interesting. But if, let's say, you're a hardcore gamer, you want consistent latency throughout it. So it has the opportunity to be able to, we can control that latency number as well on a customer by customer basis. I think ultimately where all of this is headed is ultimately consumers will be able to personalize their experiences. It could be tailored so that it's
Like a YouTuber might need more Starry than somebody that just uses it for homework or something like that. You mean like they could kind of scale up or
or
down or
flip
what they
side,
do?
you exactly, or even if you've got somebody who's not very IT literate, if you will, but as a result, they need a great customer experience and support
Right,
that allows them
right.
to
Gotcha.
you know
Yep, yep.
not be frustrated constantly about it, right? Because try calling a cable company, right? Good luck, right?
Jesus, yeah.
Hours of waiting on the phone, et cetera, et cetera. So there are different kinds of people that have different needs, obviously. And and I think a modern brand, a modern company that's focused on solving those for different things for different people has that opportunity to craft that narrative and the technology that's required to be able to do that from the ground up, and you don't have the legacy problem, right? You built a bunch of stuff that is now out there and you've got to unwind. You've got business practices, you've got financials, you got this, you got that. So you have the luxury of not being bound to the past in that sense.
We talked about Microsoft, and obviously there's even bigger giants like Amazon and others as well. Are you surprised that nobody else has tried to sort of tackle it in the way you guys have, right? Sort of customer service, being sort of paramount, which has sort of been forte for a lot of disruptional companies in certain sectors, really being obviously having great tech, but also great customer service. Are you surprised that the other people, and does it worry you maybe that bigger companies could come in with more brand recognition and just add this as a service for people, or is it just not within
You
their
know,
their wheelhouse?
it's I mean, Google obviously tried with the Google Fiber
Fiber, yeah.
attempt.
Hmm. Hmm.
But they
But that was
quickly
still digging up
realized
the ground though, right? Like it
exactly,
was,
yeah,
I lived in this city and it was, they dig up our whole block just to install. It was horrible for like two
yeah.
weeks.
That's exactly right. So they quickly realized that there was, not a winning strategy.
You know?
These kinds of technologies take years to develop. So, but these guys have lots of money and yada yada yada. So presumably they could. But then the second problem tends to be that you need licensed spectrum, and that comes in an auction and then goes away. And it takes years for those auctions to come back around with the right bands and yada yada yada. So as you think about kind of your defensive modes, you tend, you're obviously, continuously building those, but there are some natural defensive moats in this business beyond the technology and intellectual property, are, things like spectrum, which, the wireless carriers tend to own most of it, and they're not in the business of letting, Amazon or Google into their henhouse.
When you talk about cities and we talk about expanding into other cities, what's that process like for, the rest of this year and maybe, 2023? I guess what cities right now have it, and down the pipe, what other, citizens can expect this to kind of be in their communities? Like, what does the expansion city-wise look like?
Yeah, so we, now we're a public company, so we don't disclose a lot of those things
Sure,
in terms of
sure.
future plans. But today we are in Boston. We're almost 9% of the market in Boston in 3 years. So that's a pretty amazing
Wow.
thing.
Yeah.
We're in Boston. Los Angeles has a large footprint in all of these. Boston, Los Angeles, Denver, parts of Washington D.C., parts of New York. We just started in Columbus, Ohio last quarter. So, we will continue to expand and densify those cities and continue to drive growth in customers there. And then we have spectrum in about 40 million households in about 37, you know, major cities, if you will. So we will, start sequencing them in, anywhere from 1 to 4 a year that we will start adding. And the
That's
process is
great.
kind of relatively straightforward, right? So we basically start with the most rawest information tends to be census blocks, and then lower than that, actual parcel level data. So in every city kind of where the apartments are, where houses are, where this is, that is, yada yada, all commercial areas are.
Right.
So we then basically take that into our planning systems that figure out where the signal is going to propagate, where you need the towers and sites, which rooftops you need. Then we have teams that go out and do what's called site ac or site acquisition. So they will go out and basically get leases done with the tower owners or building rooftops, things along those lines.
Last question here would be around the future. And I know you can't say too much, but as you look at like successes or goals that you would like to achieve, what are those for maybe, the next decade, as much as you could say, but I'm sure you have some successes and goals that, you would like to see happen.
So number one, obviously continuing execution. We have, pretty ambitious targets in front of, and by 2026, we want to build out like 25 million homes worth of coverage, and we want to have, millions of customers, et cetera, et cetera. So those are pretty tangible, direct goals.
Yep.
And I think the biggest success for me personally will be sort of preserving the brand and integrity of the company through that process. Because it's easy to get lost in chasing dollars or chasing, whatever targets you have. And so we have our rule is, everything is decided from the lens of a customer. So we have, we basically everything is centered around customer first. And the second sort of trait that we encourage people is informed bias for action, to act. Lots of companies talk a lot, but actually doing it matters. And the third is growth with integrity for us, which is a really important thing. And the way I define it is, can you grow the business and continue to grow the business while doing what your customer wants you to do, serving your customer? So the things that we won't do and we don't do are things like selling customers data, or advertising, or even when we market to them, we don't do tracking, for example, right, on these social media things or whatever it is,
Sure.
or Facebook,
Yeah.
whatnot. So those are important, things that I think if we on the hard side, if we continue to execute and meet our targets, or we preserve these values along the way, then I think it's a win. That's kind of what I'm looking.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're super busy. Really appreciate it. I mean, it's a really tough mountain to climb here, but you and the team have executed super well so far. So, I mean, best of luck for the next decades to come, and can't wait to see it and to see Starry in more cities.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.